The city never slept, but some nights it held its breath. In the dim glow of flickering streetlights, a man walked alone, his steps careful, measured. His name was Rohan, a thief, but not just any thief. He was clever, precise, and different from the rest. He didn't steal out of greed or recklessness. He stole because he had to, because the world had never been fair to him. That night, rain drizzled lightly, casting a hazy mist over the narrow streets. The air smelled of wet asphalt and something else, anticipation. Rohan's eyes darted around, not out of fear, but calculation. Every move had to be perfect, every step taken with purpose. He had studied the layout, memorized the routines, and knew exactly when to strike. His target was a grand, old mansion at the heart of the city. It belonged to a wealthy businessman, Mr. Mehta, a man whose name commanded respect, but whose actions told a different story. Rohan had heard whispers, stories of unpaid workers, crushed dreams, and wealth built on the suffering of others. It wasn't just about taking money, it was about balancing the scales, in his own way. He slipped into the shadows, his heart steady, his mind clear. Breaking in was the easy part. The real challenge was leaving unseen. He had done this before. Many times, in fact. But tonight felt different. There was an unease in the air, a quiet warning that he couldn't quite place. Inside, the mansion was as extravagant as he had imagined. Chandeliers glittered above, gold-trimmed furniture stood untouched, and expensive paintings lined the walls. A world so far from his own, yet so easily within reach. He moved quickly, avoiding cameras and silent alarms, heading straight for the study where he knew Mr. Mehta kept a safe. Just as his fingers brushed against the cold metal of the vault, a voice broke the silence. "You're not as invisible as you think." Rohan froze. He turned slowly, his pulse quickening. A woman stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him with eyes that held something other than fear. Who was she? And why wasn't she calling for help? Rohan's breath slowed, his mind racing for an explanation, an escape. He had been careful, too careful. How had he missed her? Who was she? The woman took a step forward, her expression calm but unreadable. She wasn't afraid. That was the first thing he noticed. Most people would have screamed, panicked, maybe even tried to run. But she just stood there, studying him. The dim light from the hallway barely revealed her features, but Rohan could tell she was young, probably in her late 20s. She wore a simple dress, nothing extravagant like the rest of the house. He kept his hands steady, his voice even. "Who are you?" She tilted her head slightly, amused. "I could ask you the same." Rohan didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. Every second wasted in conversation was a second closer to getting caught. He needed to move, to get out before things got worse. But she didn't move aside. "You're here for the safe, aren't you?" His muscles tensed. Was she playing a game? Or was this some kind of trap? "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, testing her reaction. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head. "Come on, don't insult my intelligence. I've been watching you. You knew exactly where to go. You've done this before." Rohan's mind sharpened. If she had been watching him, why hadn't she stopped him sooner? Why was she still so calm? There was something odd about her presence, something that made him hesitate. "Who are you?" he asked again, this time firmer. For the first time, something shifted in her eyes. A flicker of emotion, of something deeper. "My name is Anaya," she said, her voice quieter now. "And if you're smart, you'll listen to me before you make a mistake." A mistake. The word lingered in the air between them. Rohan frowned. "I don't make mistakes." Anaya sighed, glancing toward the safe. "Oh, but you have. You think you're taking from a man who won't notice, a man who doesn't deserve what he has. But you don't know everything, do you?" He hated how sure she sounded, as if she knew something he didn't. It made him uneasy. Mr. Mehta is a corrupt businessman, Rohan said, trying to gauge her reaction. People like him take and take, leaving nothing for the rest of us. You think that's fair? Anaya's lips pressed together, and for a brief moment, Rohan thought he saw a flicker of sadness in her eyes. But she didn't answer his question. Instead, she asked one of her own. And what do you plan to do with the money you take? Rohan didn't respond right away. No one had ever asked him that before. Most people assumed he was just another thief, a man driven by greed or desperation. But it was more than that. I help people, he said finally. People who don't have another way. Anaya studied him, her expression unreadable. And do they know where it comes from? He frowned. Does it matter? Her gaze didn't waver. Maybe more than you think. Silence stretched between them. The house was still, the only sound the faint ticking of a nearby clock. Rohan had always been good at reading people, but Anaya was different. She wasn't just a bystander caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. She knew too much. She had been waiting for him. What do you want? He asked, narrowing his eyes. Anaya hesitated for the first time. Then finally she said, I want to show you something. Something that might change your mind. Rohan tensed. This was dangerous. He didn't trust her, couldn't afford to. And yet, something in her voice made him pause. There was no fear, no threat, just certainty. And that was the most unsettling thing of all. He exhaled slowly, glancing at the safe one last time before looking back at Anaya. Fine, he said. But if this is a trick, you'll regret it. Anaya didn't flinch. She simply turned and walked toward the hallway, leaving Rohan with no choice but to follow. Rohan followed Anaya through the dimly lit corridor, his instincts on high alert. The soft click of her shoes on the polished floor was the only sound between them. He still didn't know if he could trust her, but something about her presence made it impossible to walk away. There was a confidence in her steps, a quiet assurance that she was in control. He hated that. He was supposed to be the one in control. She led him to a smaller room at the far end of the hallway. It was nothing like the grand, luxurious spaces he had seen in the rest of the mansion. The walls were lined with bookshelves, and a wooden desk sat in the center, scattered with papers. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the room, making it feel oddly personal. Anaya walked to the desk, picking up a framed photograph. She turned it toward him. It was an old picture, slightly faded. A younger Mr. Mehta stood in the center, his arm around a boy, both smiling. There was something strangely genuine about it. This is his son, Anaya said, her voice quieter now. His name was Ariv. Rohan frowned, unsure why this mattered. Was? Anaya set the frame down gently. He died 5 years ago. Rohan remained silent. He wasn't sure what she wanted him to say. He had never thought about Mr. Mehta beyond his wealth and power. The idea that he had suffered a personal loss didn't change the kind of man he was. Or did it? Anaya turned back to him. You think he's just another corrupt businessman. And maybe you're right about some things. But you don't know what losing Ariv did to him. Rohan's jaw tightened. Loss doesn't justify greed. No, Anaya admitted. But it explains desperation. Rohan shook his head. He couldn't let himself feel sympathy for a man who built his empire on the suffering of others. He had seen too much, heard too many stories of people struggling while men like Mehta thrived. You're trying to make me believe he deserves to keep all this, Rohan said, gesturing around the room. That he's some kind of victim. Anaya's expression didn't change. I'm trying to make you see that nothing is as simple as it looks. Rohan exhaled sharply. He didn't have time for this. He had come here with a plan, and now everything was unraveling. He turned toward the door, but Anaya's voice stopped him. You're not the only one looking for that safe. Rohan stilled. Slowly, he turned back to her. What do you mean? Anaya walked past him, pulling open a drawer in the desk. She took out a small, black envelope and held it up. There's someone else. Someone dangerous. He's been watching Meta for months. Rohan's fingers curled into fists. He didn't like this. If there was another player in the game, it meant things were more complicated than he had thought. Who? He asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Anaya hesitated, then said, Kabir. Rohan's stomach clenched at the name. He had heard of Kabir. Everyone in the underworld had. He wasn't just a thief. He was a man who took whatever he wanted, no matter the cost. And unlike Rohan, he didn't have a code. Anaya saw the recognition in his eyes. If you take that money, you'll be making yourself a target. Kabir won't let you walk away with it. Rohan's mind raced. He had spent years staying under the radar, making sure he never attracted the wrong kind of attention. If Kabir was involved, this wasn't just about money anymore. It was about survival. He looked at Anaya, his suspicion deepening. How do you know all this? She hesitated, then finally said, because I used to work for him. Rohan's breath caught for just a second, but he quickly masked his reaction. This changed everything. If she was connected to Kabir, she could be leading him straight into a trap. You expect me to believe that? He asked. I don't care what you believe, Anaya said, meeting his gaze. But if you want to live, you'll listen. Rohan stared at her, his instincts warring with logic. He had walked into this house thinking he had everything figured out. Now, he wasn't sure of anything. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Not yet. Rohan's pulse pounded in his ears. The night had taken a turn he hadn't expected. A simple job, get in, take the money, get out, had turned into something far more dangerous. And Anaya, she was at the center of it. His instincts screamed at him to walk away, to disappear before Kabir became a real problem. But something held him back. Maybe it was the way Anaya looked at him, like she was giving him a choice, one that could change everything. How do I know you're not setting me up? Rohan asked, his voice low. Anaya exhaled, shaking her head. If I wanted you caught, you'd already be caught. She wasn't wrong. She had the chance to raise an alarm, to let security flood the mansion, but she hadn't. Instead, she had brought him here, showed him things he never would have seen. But that didn't mean he could trust her. What does Kabir want? He asked. Anaya's jaw tightened. The same thing you do. But unlike you, he won't just take the money and disappear. He wants Meta ruined. He wants him destroyed. Rohan frowned. Why? Anaya hesitated before speaking. Because Meta owes him. A long time ago, they made a deal. One that Meta broke. Kabir doesn't forgive betrayal. The weight of her words settled in Rohan's mind. This wasn't just about money anymore. If he took the cash and walked away, Kabir would see it as interference. And Kabir didn't leave loose ends. The tension between them was thick, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Anaya stepped closer, lowering her voice. You need to leave. Forget about the money. If you take it, Kabir will find you. And when he does, it won't end well. Rohan clenched his fists. He had spent years being careful, making sure he never became the kind of thief who got caught up in something bigger than himself. But this job, it had been personal. He wasn't just here for money. He was here to make a statement. Anaya must have seen the conflict in his eyes. There's another way, she said. But you have to trust me. Rohan let out a short, bitter laugh. Trust? In this game, trust gets you killed. A sound from the hallway made them both freeze. Footsteps. Heavy. Deliberate. Rohan's muscles tensed. It wasn't the light step of a house servant. This was different. Anaya's eyes flickered with something sharp. It's him. Kabir. The name sent a chill through Rohan's spine. He had never seen the man in person, but he knew his reputation. Kabir didn't hesitate. He didn't negotiate. And now he was here. Anaya moved fast, grabbing Rohan's wrist and pulling him toward the far side of the room. She pressed against a section of the bookshelf, and to Rohan's surprise, a panel slid open, revealing a hidden passageway. "Go," she whispered. Rohan didn't move. He could hear Kabir's footsteps getting closer, steady and unhurried. If he left, what would happen to Anaya? She must have seen his hesitation because she whispered urgently, "I can handle him. But if you stay, you won't make it out." Rohan's mind raced. This wasn't his fight. But walking away meant leaving unfinished business, meant leaving questions unanswered. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. Anaya pushed him toward the passage. "Go now." Rohan took one last look at her, then slipped into the darkness just as the door creaked open. Rohan moved swiftly through the narrow passage, his breath controlled but his mind racing. The walls were cold, lined with dust, as if no one had used this hidden route in years. His heartbeat matched the rhythm of his footsteps as he pushed forward, unsure where the passage would lead him. He wanted to turn back, to see what was happening with Anaya, but he knew that staying behind would only put them both in danger. Then he heard it, Kabir's voice. Even through the walls, it was clear, sharp, laced with quiet menace. "You've been busy, Anaya." Rohan slowed his steps, pressing his back against the cold stone, straining to hear her response. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice steady. A pause. Then Kabir laughed softly, a sound that sent a chill through Rohan's spine. "Don't insult me. You think I don't know who you're protecting?" Rohan clenched his jaw. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let Anaya's effort go to waste. But just as he was about to take another step, something unexpected happened. The passageway shifted. A sudden groan of stone grinding against stone filled the silence, and before Rohan could react, the floor beneath him dropped slightly. He felt himself losing balance as the wall beside him shifted, revealing another opening, one that wasn't part of the original path. He barely caught himself before stumbling forward. His heart pounded. What was this? Another hidden room? Another escape route? But as he turned to take a step inside, he stopped. This wasn't just another passage. It was a vault. Not the kind that held money or jewelry. This was something different. The dim light from the cracks in the wall barely illuminated the space, but Rohan could make out shelves stacked with files, ledgers, and stacks of paper. Some were old, yellowed with age. Others looked new, fresh. He moved cautiously, scanning the documents. Names, transactions, bank records. And then he saw it, Kabir's name. His breath hitched. There, in black ink, was a list of deals, payments, betrayals, evidence that tied Kabir not just to Mehta, but to others. Politicians, businessmen, people who had disappeared without a trace. Rohan exhaled slowly. This was bigger than he had thought. The money in the safe, it was nothing compared to this. This was power. The kind that could destroy men like Mehta. The kind that could bring Kabir to his knees. And now, Rohan had it. But before he could decide what to do next, a sound made him freeze. A second set of footsteps. Not from the room Anaya was in. Not from the hallway. From behind him. Rohan turned sharply, his body tensing. Someone else was here. Someone who knew about this passage, about this vault. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke. "I was wondering when you'd find this." Rohan's blood ran cold. He wasn't alone. Rohan's breath caught in his throat. The voice was calm, almost amused, but laced with something darker beneath the surface. Slowly, he turned toward the shadows, his muscles coiled, ready for anything. A figure stepped forward, the dim light revealing sharp, calculating eyes. It was Mehta. Rohan hadn't expected this. He had assumed Mehta was somewhere else in the mansion, unaware of what was happening. But now, standing face to face with the man he had planned to steal from, he realized something chilling. Meta had known all along. You look surprised, Meta said, his voice even. Did you really think you were the only one playing this game? Rohan stayed silent, his mind racing. If Meta had been expecting him, then that meant. Anaya led you here, Meta continued, tilting his head slightly. Didn't she? Rohan's stomach twisted. He wanted to deny it, but the pieces were falling into place too quickly. The way she had guided him through the house. The way she had known exactly where to find the secret passage. The way she had insisted he leave, right before he discovered the vault. Had she planned this? Meta took another step forward, his gaze unreadable. You're smart, Rohan. Smarter than most. But you let emotions get in the way. You thought Anaya was helping you. You thought she cared. Rohan clenched his fists. And what if she does? Meta chuckled, shaking his head. She works for Kabir. The words hit like a punch to the gut. Rohan refused to believe it. Anaya had warned him about Kabir, had told him to leave before it was too late. But what if it had all been part of the plan? What if she had been playing both sides? You think she betrayed you? Meta continued, watching Rohan closely. Or are you hoping she didn't? Rohan's mind was a storm of confusion, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford doubt now. Not when he was standing in the middle of the biggest secret in Meta's empire. What do you want? Rohan asked, his voice measured. Meta smiled. A deal. That caught Rohan off guard. He had expected threats, violence, maybe even death, but not a negotiation. You have two choices, Meta continued. Walk away now empty-handed, and I'll forget this ever happened. Rohan narrowed his eyes. And the second option? Meta's smile widened. You take those files. You bring them to Kabir. And you finish what Anaya started. Rohan's pulse quickened. What are you saying? I'm saying Kabir thinks he's in control. But I know his weakness, Meta said. You give him those files, and he'll believe he's won. He'll lower his guard. And then... He didn't have to finish the sentence. Rohan understood. Meta wasn't asking him to deliver evidence. He was setting a trap. He wanted Rohan to walk straight into Kabir's world, play the role of a pawn, and then strike when the moment was right. Rohan hesitated. He had never been interested in power struggles. He had always worked alone, slipping in and out of places without making a ripple. But this was bigger than a simple heist. Why me? He asked. Meta's expression turned serious. Because you're the only one who can. Rohan exhaled slowly. Every instinct told him to run, to get out before he was pulled even deeper. But another part of him, the part that had spent years watching men like Meta and Kabir build empires on the backs of others, knew this was an opportunity. He could walk away, pretend none of this had happened. Or he could step into the fire and change everything. The weight of the decision settled over him. And then, without another word, he reached for the files. Meta smiled. Good choice. But just as Rohan turned to leave, the door to the vault creaked open. And standing there, her expression unreadable, was Anaya. Everything inside Rohan went still. For the first time, he had no idea what was coming next. Rohan's grip tightened around the files as he locked eyes with Anaya. A storm of emotion swirled in his chest. Anger, confusion, betrayal. He wanted to demand answers, to ask if Meta was telling the truth, but the words caught in his throat. The way she stood there, unreadable yet calm, sent a chill down his spine. Meta remained still, watching the exchange with quiet amusement. Ah, and here she is. The woman of the hour. Anaya didn't react to his taunt. Instead, she looked directly at Rohan. Don't do this. Rohan's jaw tightened. Do what? Whatever he promised you, she said, her voice steady. It's not what it seems. Meta chuckled, stepping aside slightly. And let me guess, Kabir has a better offer? Anaya ignored him, taking a slow step forward. Rohan, you don't have to be part of this. Just walk away. This isn't your fight. Rohan let out a short, bitter laugh. It wasn't supposed to be. But you pulled me into it. She hesitated, guilt flickering in her eyes. I never meant to. Then why? He asked, the frustration spilling into his voice. Why did you lead me here? Why help me at all? Anaya looked away for a brief moment, then exhaled. Because I thought you were different. I thought you would take the money and run. That you wouldn't get caught up in this mess. Rohan felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. And yet, here we are. Mehta sighed, checking his watch. This is all very touching, but we have a deal to finalize. He turned to Anaya. Unless you plan to stop him? Her eyes darkened. I will if I have to. Rohan's heart pounded. He had seen Anaya fight before. She wasn't one to make empty threats. If she had chosen Kabir's side, this could end badly. But was she really here for Kabir, or was there something else she wasn't saying? Mehta stepped back, watching with amusement. I'd love to see how this plays out. Rohan had had enough. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to clear his mind. This wasn't about trust anymore. It was about survival. He turned to Anaya. Tell me the truth. Are you working for Kabir? She hesitated, and that hesitation told him everything. Mehta smirked. That's all you need to know. Rohan felt something inside him shift. He had been played from the very beginning, by both of them. The realization should have made him angry, but instead, it made things clear. This was never about money or power. It was about control. Kabir and Mehta were locked in a silent war, and Rohan had been nothing more than a tool, a clever thief caught between two predators. But he wasn't about to let either of them win. Slowly, he stepped back, holding up the files. These are what you both want, right? Anaya's expression hardened. Rohan, don't. Mehta tilted his head, intrigued. What are you planning? Without another word, Rohan reached for the nearest candle on the shelf, the small flame flickering in the dim room. In one swift motion, he pressed the fire against the edge of the documents. The flame caught instantly. Anaya's eyes widened. No! Mehta's smirk vanished. You fool! But it was too late. The fire spread rapidly, consuming the pages, turning them into ash. Rohan didn't flinch. He watched as the carefully guarded secrets of both men burned before their eyes, the heat of the flames warming his skin. He had no intention of being a pawn in their war. Mehta cursed under his breath, stepping back. Do you have any idea what you've done? Rohan looked at him, unshaken. Yeah. I made sure neither of you wins. Anaya looked torn, anger and something else flashing across her face. But she didn't move to stop him. The fire crackled, the smoke rising toward the ceiling. The secrets that had built empires were gone. Mehta exhaled sharply. You're either the dumbest thief I've ever met, or the smartest. Rohan gave him a wry smile. I'll take my chances. For a moment, no one spoke. The tension in the room was thick, but there was nothing left to fight over. The game was over. Finally, Anaya stepped back, her voice quieter. You should go. Rohan didn't argue. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the vault, out of the mansion, and into the night. The cool air hit his skin as he stepped onto the empty streets. He didn't know what came next. Maybe Kabir would come looking for him. Maybe Mehta would try to settle the score. But none of that mattered right now. For the first time in years, Rohan felt free. He had walked into that mansion as a thief, expecting to leave with riches. Instead, he had walked away with something far more valuable. A choice. And he had made the right one.